Welcome to The Midnight Secrets. The haunting of the cursed painting. Nestled in a remote village, hidden among thick forests and shrouded by a perpetual mist, there lies a museum that time forgot. The building itself is old and weathered, its walls cracking under the weight of years gone by. Few visitors ever find their way here, but those who do are inevitably drawn to a single artifact, a painting known as the Weeping Lady. The painting was created in the late 1800s by Victor Desmond, a once prominent artist whose life spiraled into tragedy. Victor was known for his vivid portraits, capturing the essence of his subjects with almost supernatural precision. But this particular painting was different. It depicted a woman, young and beautiful, dressed in period clothing with a haunted expression. Her tear-streaked face seemed almost alive. Her eyes were dark, hollow voids that followed anyone who dared to stand before the canvas. But what set this piece apart from any other was its unsettling aura. The woman's lips were twisted into a ghostly smile that made her tears all the more chilling. The woman in the painting was Amelia, Victor's fiancée and muse. They were set to be married, but days before the wedding, tragedy struck. Amelia fell gravely ill, her condition deteriorating rapidly despite the best efforts of doctors. Within a week, she was gone, leaving Victor heartbroken and shattered. Grief consumed him, and he locked himself away in his studio, refusing to see anyone or eat. The only sound that emerged from his isolation was the steady scrape of his brush on canvas as he worked tirelessly, day and night, to immortalize his lost love. For weeks, Victor barely slept, driven by a desperate belief that if he could capture Amelia's essence perfectly, he could bring her back. But the deeper he delved into his work, the more twisted and dark his creation became. Friends who visited him described seeing shadows flitting across the room, whispering voices that grew louder as Victor painted. When he finally completed the portrait, he collapsed, muttering incoherently, "She's in there. I trapped her." Victor was found delirious and barely alive. He was taken to bed, but he never fully recovered. On his deathbed, he raved about seeing Amelia's spirit in the painting, begging to be freed, her voice growing louder each night. His final words before slipping into eternal sleep were a chilling cry, "I've cursed us both." The painting was left abandoned in his studio until it was discovered years later by an unsuspecting collector. However, it quickly became known as a cursed object as each of its owners met untimely fates. The painting eventually ended up in the village museum, where it was displayed for curious visitors. But from the moment it was hung, strange occurrences began to plague the building. The museum staff noticed that the room where the painting was displayed was always colder than the rest of the building, despite the heating being on full. Visitors complained of feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow or dread when they looked into the eyes of the woman in the painting. Some swore they could hear faint sobbing when they stood too close, while others claimed the woman's tears seemed to glisten as if they were fresh. Harold, the museum's night guard, was a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghost stories or curses and thought the tales about the painting were nonsense. But one night, as he made his rounds, he decided to take a closer look at the Weeping Lady. The moment he approached, the temperature dropped. He could see his breath in the cold air despite the heaters running at full power. When he stared into the woman's eyes, a chill ran down his spine. It was as if those eyes were staring back at him, filled with a mix of sorrow and something darker, resentment. Harold shook it off and turned to leave, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The woman's lips, once frozen in that eerie smile, seemed to twitch. Startled, he turned back to the painting and found himself face to face with a nightmarish vision. The woman's head had turned, and her eyes were glaring directly at him, filled with anger and malevolence. A voice, soft and sorrowful, whispered his name. Terrified, Harold stumbled backward and fled the room. He refused to return, leaving the museum immediately and never coming back. Word of his encounter spread quickly, drawing the attention of paranormal investigators. They set up equipment to capture any supernatural activity, recording unexplained voices, cold spots, and shadowy figures that seemed to move within the painting itself. Despite these warnings, the painting remained on display, attracting thrill seekers and ghost hunters. But as time passed, fewer visitors dared to approach the Weeping Lady. The museum eventually placed it behind thick glass, but that didn't stop the incidents. Several visitors claimed that the woman's eyes followed them as they moved around the room. Some even reported that they heard a faint voice pleading for help, growing more desperate the longer they stayed. To this day, the painting hangs in the quiet, dark corner of the museum. The woman's tears seem more lifelike with each passing year, as if she is still trapped, still crying for someone to release her from her torment. Those brave enough to stand before the painting swear they can feel a presence, a cold, sorrowful entity watching them, waiting for the next soul to draw too close. The mummy that never rested. In one of the grandest museums of Europe, housed within a sprawling neoclassical building, there lies an exhibit that has long been the source of fear and fascination, the Egyptian Hall. The hall is filled with treasures from the ancient world, golden relics, statues of gods, and the well-preserved remains of long-dead pharaohs. But among all these wonders, the centerpiece is the mummy of Angkor, a high priest from the time of Ramses II, who was said to possess knowledge of dark and forbidden magic. Angkor's tomb was discovered in the late 1800s by an ambitious archaeologist, Sir Edward Harrington, who was determined to make his mark on history. Despite warnings from local guides and the ominous curses etched into the walls of the tomb, Sir Edward ordered his team to break the seals and remove the treasures within, including the priest's mummy. Almost immediately, misfortune struck the expedition. Sir Edward was struck by a sudden fever that left him bedridden for weeks. Several workers met tragic fates, including one who was crushed by a collapsing wall, and another who mysteriously vanished in the desert. Undeterred by these events, Sir Edward returned to England with his spoils, including the sarcophagus of Angkor, which was displayed in the museum as part of a grand exhibition. But the troubles were far from over. The mummy was notorious for the strange occurrences surrounding it. Visitors reported an unnatural coldness near the sarcophagus, and some claimed they could hear faint chanting in ancient Egyptian whenever they stood too close. Many felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something malevolent was watching them from within the sarcophagus. The museum staff soon noticed that the Egyptian hall had a reputation for being unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer. Despite the building's modern heating system, the temperature in the hall would often drop to near freezing levels, especially after sunset. Security guards frequently heard footsteps and whispers in the darkness when the hall was supposed to be empty. One guard, Richard, was particularly skeptical and decided to investigate the stories himself. One evening, while making his rounds, Richard entered the Egyptian hall. As he approached the sarcophagus, the lights began to flicker. He shrugged it off as an electrical issue, but then he heard it, a low, rumbling sound that grew louder with each step he took. When he reached the sarcophagus, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The mummy, once lying still and lifeless within the ornate casket, was now standing upright, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The linen wrappings had begun to unravel, as if something inside was trying to break free. Frozen in terror, Richard could only stare as the mummy slowly turned its head toward him. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and a voice whispered in his ear, speaking in a language he didn't understand. It was as though the dead priest was trying to communicate with him, perhaps to issue a warning, or perhaps to curse him for disturbing his rest. Richard didn't wait to find out. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. He never returned to work, quitting the next morning without even collecting his belongings. After Richard's encounter, the museum's management tried to downplay the incident, but the stories persisted. Paranormal researchers were brought in to investigate. They reported bizarre electromagnetic readings, cold spots, and inexplicable malfunctions in their equipment whenever they neared the sarcophagus. Some claimed to hear chanting in ancient Egyptian captured on their audio devices, while others saw shadows moving across the room when there was no one there. The situation escalated when several visitors fell ill after standing too close to the sarcophagus. One woman fainted, claiming that she felt as though unseen hands were pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Another visitor fled in panic after seeing the mummy's eyes move, convinced that the priest's spirit was trying to escape. Faced with growing public fear, the museum decided to close the Egyptian hall temporarily and consult experts in Egyptian lore. A noted Egyptologist was brought in and immediately recommended performing a ritual to appease the spirit of Angkor. The museum reluctantly agreed, and the ritual was carried out, complete with offerings of food, wine, and prayers to the gods. For a time, the disturbances seemed to subside, but the uneasy atmosphere never fully lifted. Today, the Egyptian hall remains open, but the sarcophagus of Angkor is kept under heavy glass and surrounded by protective symbols designed to keep the spirit at bay. Yet, those who work in the museum after hours still speak of strange occurrences, whispers in the dead of night, shadows that shouldn't be there, and the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, is watching from within the darkened depths of the hall. Visitors continue to flock to see the mummy, but many leave with a sense of unease, feeling as if they've just come face to face with something truly ancient and evil. The curse of Angkor, it seems, remains very much alive, a dark reminder of the dangers of disturbing the dead. The doll in the Hall of Shadows. There is a museum in a quiet town where locals seldom visit. It's an unassuming place with exhibits ranging from historical artifacts to odd curiosities. However, one particular room draws a certain kind of visitor, those with a taste for the macabre. This room, known as the Hall of Shadows, houses the museum's collection of dolls, each with its own eerie history. But there is one doll that stands out from the rest, a small porcelain figure with hauntingly lifelike eyes. Her name is Annabelle. Annabelle's story begins in a remote village, where she once belonged to a little girl named Emily who lived in the late 1800s. Emily was a lonely child, her only companion being the doll her parents gave her on her 5th birthday. The doll was exquisitely made, with glass eyes that seemed almost alive and a face painted with delicate features. Emily adored Annabelle, spending hours talking to her, dressing her in fine clothes, and treating her as her closest friend. But tragedy struck when Emily suddenly became gravely ill. Her condition worsened quickly, and within days, she passed away, leaving her parents heartbroken. In their grief, they buried Emily with the doll she loved so dearly, hoping it would bring her comfort in the afterlife. But not long after the funeral, something inexplicable happened. Annabelle was found sitting in Emily's bedroom, despite being buried with her in the family plot. Shocked and terrified, Emily's parents believed it to be some cruel prank, but no one could explain how the doll had returned. They tried locking Annabelle in the attic, but she always found her way back to Emily's room. Desperate to rid themselves of the cursed doll, they eventually donated her to the museum, hoping to escape whatever malevolent force was attached to it. The museum placed Annabelle in the Hall of Dolls, where she quickly became the subject of local legends and eerie stories. Visitors often reported that the doll's eyes moved, following them as they walked through the room. Some even claimed to see her smile, a chilling, malevolent grin that appeared when no one else was looking. The museum's night guards were particularly uneasy about Annabelle. They often heard soft giggles echoing through the hall when they were on patrol, or saw fleeting shadows dart across the room. One guard swore that he heard a child's voice whisper his name late one night, only to turn and see Annabelle's head tilted slightly in his direction, her eyes staring straight at him. As the years passed, the stories surrounding Annabelle grew darker. Strange accidents plagued the museum staff who had to handle or move the doll. One curator tripped and broke his leg after noticing Annabelle's reflection in a window where she shouldn't have been. Another suffered a series of vivid nightmares, in which the doll would come to life, crawling across the floor with jerky, unnatural movements, whispering threats in a childlike voice. These nightmares grew so intense that the curator eventually quit, unable to bear the thought of returning to work. Things took an even darker turn when a new security guard, Thomas, was assigned to the night shift. He had heard the stories but dismissed them as silly superstitions. Determined to prove there was nothing to fear, he made it a point to stay late in the Hall of Dolls one night, keeping a close eye on Annabelle. For hours, nothing happened, and Thomas felt increasingly smug. But just as he was about to leave, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Turning toward Annabelle's case, he saw her tiny porcelain hand tapping against the glass, as if trying to get his attention. Frozen in place, Thomas watched in horror as the doll's head slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, usually dull and lifeless, now gleamed with a cold intelligence. Her lips, once frozen in a neutral expression, curled into a sinister smile. The air in the room grew icy cold, and Thomas could hear the faint sound of a child humming a lullaby. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The lullaby grew louder, and with it came the sensation of unseen hands brushing against his skin. Panicking, Thomas finally broke free of his paralysis and bolted for the exit. As he ran, he heard the glass shatter behind him, followed by a sharp, childlike laugh that echoed in his ears long after he had escaped the building. He never returned to work after that night, leaving the museum short-staffed and shaken by his experience. Rumors spread that the doll had broken free of her case, though no one dared check until morning. When they finally entered the room, they found Annabelle back in her case, but the glass was indeed cracked, and her face was pressed against it, as if she had been watching them all along. After Thomas's departure, the museum decided to move Annabelle to a locked storage room deep in the basement, away from the public and the rest of the collection. But even there, she continued to cause disturbances. Staff reported that her position would change, even though no one had touched her. Some found her face pressed against the glass, as if she were trying to peer out. Others claimed to hear soft cries echoing from the basement late at night, always accompanied by the faint scent of flowers, a smell associated with funerals. Eventually, the museum contacted a paranormal expert, who recommended sealing Annabelle in a protective case lined with salt and blessed by a priest. The doll was placed in the case and hidden away in a secure vault, where she remains to this day. But those who have been near the vault say they still feel her presence, a cold, malevolent energy that lingers in the air, as if she is waiting for someone to set her free once more. Staff avoid that part of the building, fearing that one day, Annabelle might escape again. The Hall of Dolls is still open to visitors, but it is often empty, with most guests preferring to avoid the room altogether. Those who do enter rarely stay long, unnerved by the watchful eyes of hundreds of lifeless faces, and perhaps something more that lurks in the shadows, waiting for its next victim.